Thank you, Amira. And Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today for this briefing on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. Allow me to please first start by introducing our distinguished speakers who are joining me on the panel today. Firstly, His Excellency Mr. Yaremenko, Deputy Minister for Reintegration of the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. His Excellency Mr. Kyslytsya, Ambassador and the Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the United Nations based in New York. Ms. Osnat Lubrani, the United Nations Resident Coordinator and Humanitarian Coordinator in Iraq. And Ms. Lavskoya, the General Coordinator of MSF in Ukraine. Excellencies, before I hand the floor to our speakers, please allow me to make a few short introductory remarks on the global humanitarian needs and the current humanitarian context in Ukraine. As you all know, last year in December, we launched the Global Humanitarian Overview for 2021. This is the most comprehensive and evidence-based assessment of humanitarian needs and trends. Globally, in 2021, 235 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance. As we all know, COVID has had devastating impacts, not only on the health of millions of people across the globe, but also beyond the immediate health impact. This impact falls heaviest on the most vulnerable in the world. This year, the United Humanitarian partners aim to assist 160 million people with life-saving support. In order to achieve this goal, we are appealing for $35 billion. This is the highest global appeal we have ever had. The good news is that due to the very generous support of yourselves, the donors and member states, last year we received a record 17 billion US dollars to help reduce the suffering. Firstly, to thank very much the member states who contributed so generously and sent a loud signal of solidarity across the world to those who need it most. The gap is increasing, even though the generosity last year is the highest for many, many years. The response plan in Ukraine in 2021 was also very well funded at 126.8 million US dollars, which is almost 62% of the total requirement. And the humanitarian community was able to successfully reach more than 1 million people in 2020 in Ukraine. This is actually quite a significant amount, and I think the humanitarian community there with the government can be quite proud. However, there is a gap in those that we have reached in Ukraine. Only a fraction of those that live in areas beyond government control were accessed, and that is where the needs are the most severe. Humanitarian access continues to be limited to those areas. We do require full and unimpeded humanitarian access to be able to provide to the most vulnerable. Looking ahead, the Humanitarian Response Plan in Ukraine for 2021 aims to address the needs of 1.9 million people and appeals for 168 million US dollars. Today's briefing is an important opportunity to hear about the efforts on the ground from the Ukrainian government and the resident humanitarian coordinator and our NGO partners, as well as to remind us that the people in Ukraine still need our assistance and attention. So thank you very much for being here. Let me now first invite His Excellency Kyslytsya, the permanent Ambassador Kyslytsya, the permanent representative of Ukraine, to provide his remarks. Ambassador, over to you.
Well, thank you, Reena, and good morning and good afternoon, dear friends and dear colleagues. Ukraine commands the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs for holding this important briefing on the humanitarian situation in eastern Ukraine. I would like to express gratitude to all UN agencies, our bilateral partners and humanitarian actors for their efforts aimed at improving the unsatisfactory living conditions of the civilian population in the conflict-affected areas of Donbas, caused by the Russian aggression. We count that the 2021 Humanitarian Response Plan for Ukraine will be properly financed and implemented. At the same time, the humanitarian crisis in eastern Ukraine cannot be considered in isolation from its causes. That is why I would like to use this opportunity to draw your attention to the plenary debate of the General Assembly. On agenda item 65, the situation in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine to be held on the 23rd February this year. The meeting will allow us to discuss the sheer scale and far-reaching repercussions of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict in all its complexity, including humanitarian, social, political, security, human rights, ecological, gender, and other dimensions. In view of this, we encourage active participation by all delegations in this debate. I'm very happy to see many of my current and former colleagues. I'm very grateful to all the efforts by Asnat, who, as I understand, recently traveled to the East, and I'm sure she brought many personal and professional experiences from her latest trip. I'm happy to see my colleague, OCHA, Ambassador of Lithuania, who recently was appointed the president of the Bureau of the UNICEF, and the UNICEF is an important actor in Ukraine. Pablo Mateo is a very good friend of ours, and he's a very dedicated leader of among a very wide UN family of in Ukraine. So, and Ihor Yaremenko is very, very well known in New York. He used to be here. He made many wonderful things to advance the cause of fighting the aggression and the occupation of Crimea. And I'm very happy that today he's one of the key persons in the government of Ukraine dealing with the situation in the temporarily occupied territories. So thank you, every one of you, and we are looking forward to this important event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your opening remarks, and we look forward to the further engagement with you in this session. Let me now please invite His Excellency Yaremenko, Deputy Minister for Reintegration, the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. First of all, good morning to everyone, those who are situated in New York. Very glad to see all of you. And of course, good afternoon to those who are situated in Kiev, my colleagues, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I shall express my deep gratitude to sponsors for holding this briefing on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. The government of Ukraine highly appreciates efforts of the United Nations, international humanitarian community, and all the donors that, considering challenging work environment, continue to support Ukrainian citizens affected by the armed aggression of the Russian Federation for more than 6 years. It shall be noted that in times of COVID-19 pandemics in 2020, humanitarian community provided assistance to a larger number of people in need comparing to previous years. The Humanitarian Response Plan 2020 has implementation indication of 62%. We acknowledge achieved results and sincerely hope to continue and increase our cooperation to restore peace in Ukraine. For over the past 6 years, many IDPs have integrated into their new places of residence. However, this does not allow us to forget about the civilian population residing in the temporarily occupied territories and bearing the burden of the negative consequences of the activities of the occupying administrations of the Russian Federation. Armed aggression of the Russian Federation caused humanitarian crisis on the temporarily occupied territories, affecting millions of innocent Ukrainians. As a result of the aggression, the purchasing power of the civilian population decreased and access to educational and medical services deteriorated. The situation with food security remains especially critical. Particular concern shall be expressed due to the fact that occupying administrations of the Russian Federation do not take sufficient measures to stop the spread of coronavirus, withhold from local population information about it, morbidity rates, and deprive the civilian population from the opportunities to protect one's health. That is why we constantly call on international humanitarian organizations within the framework of their respective mandates to intensify the monitoring of the situation regarding medical care for the residents of the temporarily occupied territories and to inform the international community about blatant violations of human rights to life and health by the Russian occupation administrations. Let me briefly touch upon some measures taken by the government of Ukraine in 2020. First of all, I will stress that the government ensured the work of all entry-exit checkpoints on the contact line in Donetsk and Luhansk regions, as well as administrative border between Kherson region and the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. However, the Russian armed forces continue to block 5 entry-exit checkpoints in Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Therefore, due to the position of occupying power, only 2 entry-exit checkpoints operate in a limited mode, one in Luhansk region and one in Donetsk region. I shall also draw your attention that in November 2020, Ukraine has opened a brand new ECP in Shastya, and Madame Osna had a chance to visit. That ECP is a newly constructed, and it also incorporates a center for administrative services where everyone may get all the necessary social and administrative services. Another center for administrative services has been opened in Novotroitsky in Donetsk region in December last year. This year, we have an ambitious plan to open identical centers for administrative services at the rest of entry-exit checkpoints in Donetsk and Luhansk regions, as well as at the administrative border with Crimea. The government is well aware of the duties of the states before its citizens, so an exhaustive list and volumes of restricted or prohibited goods for transfer, as well as a simplified procedure for movement of humanitarian goods by international humanitarian organizations to the temporarily occupied territories has been introduced this year. The entry-exit procedure for children under the age of 16 has also been simplified, and the humanitarian grounds for crossing the ECP during movement restrictions due to COVID-19 have been introduced on the government level as well. The housing problems of IDPs and victims of armed aggression have not gone unnoticed. I would like to emphasize that in the period from 2017 to 2020, at the expense of the subvention, 340 apartments have been purchased for more than 1,100 IDPs. This year, we're planning to purchase as many apartments as it has been done in the previous 4 years. This would allow providing temporary housing for around 850 people. In 2021, about $4.5 million has been allocated for financing this program. In addition, in December 2020, the agreement between the government of Ukraine and Germany has been ratified. It provisioned 25.5 million euros for the purposes to provide housing for about 680 IDPs families, which will enable them to get a mortgage at 3% per annum. Particular attention shall be given to the start of compensation process to the first 74 victims of destroyed as a result of armed aggression housing in 2020. In 2021, it is planned to pay compensation to more than 380 victims. Heavy shelling of water supply infrastructure objects by the armed forces of the Russian Federation raised a sharp problem of access to drinking water. In 2020, with the French support, a project aimed at providing more than 500,000 residents of Mariupol with drinking water has been launched. A similar project is planned to be implemented in Luhansk region in 2021. The total cost of the projects amounts to over $160 million. It is worth noting that in 2020, in times of global pandemics, the government has provided uninterrupted accrual of social allowances and pensions for residents of the temporarily occupied territories. We also resolved the issue of IDP participation in local elections and launched electronic IDP certificate, which will facilitate access to administrative services to almost 1.5 million IDPs. Active work is underway to facilitate access to education for residents of the temporarily occupied territories as well. 2,026 children from the temporarily occupied territories benefited from a new program allowing to enroll to any institution of higher education under a separate quota in 2020. All in all, 4.5 million has been allocated for the purposes of integration of youth from the temporarily occupied territories in 2021. In addition, in 2020, the concept of economic development of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, which shall provide conditions for improving the quality of life of our citizens, as well as a full-scale reintegration of temporarily occupied territories, has been approved by the government. I'm proud to inform you that our ministry has also drafted a law of Ukraine on state policy of the transitional period, introducing our view to the process of reintegration of the temporarily occupied territories, implementation of the transitional justice provisions, etc. And the last but not least, the ministry also works on the concept of development and popularization of the Crimean Tatar language, which is suffering due to the restrictions in Crimea. As one may see, the work is carried out in many dimensions, from extension of legal frameworks to the introduction of modern technologies. Also in 2021, the government has provided a significant increase in humanitarian funding. However, the situation remains difficult and even deteriorates due to the pandemic and criminal activity of the occupying administrations of the Russian Federation, which not only abstain from applying necessary measures, but also create barriers to receive assistance. Therefore, the continuation of humanitarian activities and ensuring access of civilian population to livelihoods is critically important. In order to respond to the humanitarian crisis in the east of the country, we constantly and fruitfully cooperate with OCHA, ICRC, SDC, other UN agencies and international humanitarian organizations that assist affected populations, people in need of protection, housing, water, food, medicine, and other necessities. To solve the full range of humanitarian problems, Ukraine requires reliable support in implementation of humanitarian response plan measures by the international partners and donors. The government supports humanitarian response that meets needs of the current humanitarian situation on the ground and that correlate with the government's priority regarding meeting the needs of civilians affected by the armed aggression of the Russian Federation. We're convinced that the combined efforts of the government and the world humanitarian community will allow us significantly improve the humanitarian situation in the temporarily occupied territory. I take this opportunity to call on the representatives of the UN member states to provide necessary support for the implementation of the Humanitarian Response Plan for 2021. And I thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It was very good to hear your government's response and the forward-looking vision as well that you have. Please let me now offer the floor to the Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator. Osnat, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Reena. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us here today to discuss The situation that is worsening in terms of the humanitarian impact of the armed conflict in eastern Ukraine, a situation that has been further compounded due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm very pleased that I'm joined today by the representatives of the Permanent Mission to Ukraine and the United Nations in New York, as well as the Ministry of Reintegration of the Temporary Occupied Territories, Mr. Kyslytsya, Mr. Yaremenko, as well as Médicos del Mundo, one of our NGO partners. And I also very pleased that my colleagues from the humanitarian country team, Pablo and Jaime, UNHCR and UNFPA are also here. And I want to say big thanks to OCHA Director, Ms. Reena Ghelani, for facilitating today's discussion. Excellencies, let me start by thanking you all for the continuing support provided to our humanitarian efforts in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of eastern Ukraine. It is making a very important difference in the lives of millions of conflict-weary people. A key concern and message from all of us is to avoid any politicization of the humanitarian agenda so that we can continue to effectively assist those more in need on the ground. This past Saturday, I returned from a trip to the areas in eastern Ukraine that are not under government control. I visited communities where I met people who have lived in grave conditions now for almost 7 years. And I want to use this space today to share with you some of their voices that are not being heard enough. The people that I met, first of all, you should know, shared with me their big appreciation for the assistance received from the UN and our humanitarian partners. They also described a situation of increasing hardship due to the prolonged conflict that is now compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic and particularly the inability to cross to the government-controlled areas. All of them speak of a yearning to return to a normal, peaceful, and dignified life. But they also speak of the increasing economic and other types of stress that make it very important for them to see our support continuing. With this in mind, it is regrettable that humanitarian actors, we continue to have limited access to people who need us the most. And I can't stress enough that all the concerned parties must do more to allow and to facilitate rapid and unimpeded humanitarian relief for civilians in need and respect for the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. Excellencies, we all welcomed with enormous relief and hope the July 2020 ceasefire that brought the longest period of relative calm since the beginning of the conflict. Unfortunately, people in the conflict-affected areas and the SMM, as the OSCE SMM report says, there are increased incidents of ceasefire violations, including alleged use of heavy weapons in the past several weeks, which is a concerning trend, even though I want to say that the number of incidents have not yet reached the levels seen before the ceasefire took hold. Nevertheless, civilians do continue to be killed and maimed, and critical civilian infrastructure, including water and sanitation facilities, continue to come under fire. I'm sure you will all join me in a call to all parties to fully adhere and to preserve the ceasefire, not just through statements, but in action, consistent with the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire in order to prevent further loss of life and injury. In Ukraine, COVID-19 has further strained the resilience of conflict-affected people. In a region with already fragile economic situation, a weakened healthcare system, disrupted social service provision, people have had to tighten their belts even further to deal with the impacts of COVID-19. And for some, it really comes often to make a difficult choice between buying food and buying medicine. And that's a terrible choice to be forced to make and deprives people of basic human rights and their very dignity. For hundreds of thousands of people who depend on access to social benefits and services on the government-controlled side of the contact line, the almost complete COVID-19 related closure of all crossing points now for a 10th month has resulted in a 97% decrease in crossing. And it's really devastating for me. You know, from this last visit, hearing from one woman that she never imagined that she would miss those long lines and difficult times of having to cross the contact line. And it is so regrettable indeed. There are brand new service centers that are now established at the crossing points that are ready to serve the people, but only a small fraction of those in need can access them at this time from the areas not under government control. It will surely take more months before the pandemic is over. And so in the meantime, I firmly believe that solutions can be found to increase the freedom of movement, open greater access to services safely and responsibly to alleviate the suffering of those most vulnerable. And human security should be at the center of all efforts and not secondary to other considerations. As Ms. Reena Ghelani has mentioned, the number of people in need of assistance in 2021 is similar to the year before, 3.4 million, but their needs are even more severe because of COVID-19 and its effects. In 2021, we expect people to face growing challenges with access to healthcare, water, and hygiene due to the direct effects of the pandemic. Their need for support in food, medicine, and hygiene products is higher this year and expected to continue increasing. And also people's physical and mental well-being has been additionally impacted by the pandemic, and the demand for psychosocial support services is anticipated to be high. Since the contact line is also expected to remain substantially closed at least until the summer of 2021, the provision of protection-related services will be essential for people to get through this another year of conflict. This year, we will target 1.9 million most vulnerable people under the new Humanitarian Response Plan, through which we seek 168 million. In our response, we will continue to focus on saving lives, ensuring people's access to basic services, and strengthening the protection of those affected by the conflict and COVID-19. And as you know, to complement what we heard from Mr. Yaremenko, I want to acknowledge the very important improvements seen in establishing service centers, providing improved services to conflict-affected people. And I want to say that recognizing the strong capacity of the government at all levels, as a humanitarian community, we remain very keen and ready to support the government in improving service delivery and ensuring the longer term sustainability in the government-controlled areas. And we are also expecting gradual progress in our efforts to open humanitarian access for new organizations to operate in areas not under government control, as COVID-19 related needs will remain high and health providers' capacity will continue to be overstretched. Until a sustainable political solution is found, the people will continue to suffer and rely on humanitarian assistance to survive. Despite the challenges we have faced and related restrictions due to the pandemic, we will be able to deliver assistance to over 1 million people, and in 2020, slightly more than in the year before. While this is strong indication of our ability to adapt to the fast changing operational environment, we reached only half of the people who required our assistance. The UN and its humanitarian partners remain fully committed to continue providing humanitarian assistance in all areas affected by the conflict, in line with humanitarian principles. To sustain our delivery and to reach more people in 2021, we count on all concerned to facilitate our humanitarian operations on both sides of the contact line in adherence with international humanitarian law and other international standards. And we also count on the continued strong financial support of member states. I count on your commitment to this appeal. Thank you.
Thank you, Osnat, for that compelling call for collective action to continue and for outlining the challenges, but also the hope. Let me now please turn to our next distinguished panel member, Ms. Mazlovskaya, Medicos del Monde. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like, first of all, to thank all the organizers, Ms. Lubrani, OCHA, and Ms. Ghelani also for your kind invitation, and also to Excellencies Mr. Yaremenko and Ambassador Kyslytsya for the opportunity to have this discussion. I'm pleased to speak today on behalf of Medicos del Mundo, medical humanitarian organization active in the eastern Ukraine since 2015 and working on both sides of the contact line. My observations today are based on the Medicos del Mundo's fieldwork, as well as reflections from other national and international humanitarian organizations currently implementing projects in eastern Ukraine. And many thanks for their kind contributions. Medicos del Mundo has been focusing on providing healthcare services in Lugansk and Donetsk regions, both in governmental and non-governmental controlled areas, for the population living in the area close to the line of contact. In the governmental controlled area, MDM provides general medical consultations, mental health and psychosocial support, sexual and reproductive health consultations to the most vulnerable population living in isolated villages along the line of contact, supporting the local healthcare system. In Lugansk region, non-controlled by the government, Medicos del Mundo supports hospitals, health and social facilities with critical life-saving medical donations to support those who are the most difficult to reach. The outbreak of the new coronavirus in Ukraine, where the first case was registered in March 2020, put additional pressure on an already overstretched health system in these conflict-affected regions and challenged its resilience and the country's capacity to respond. This pandemic came on the top of the difficulties the population in the conflict-affected area is already facing to access basic services and realize their right to health. Those include lack of health staff, with around 40% shortage of medical doctors and specialists, lack of pharmacies and public transportation to reach healthcare centers, insufficient resources of the population to purchase medications or to pay for healthcare consultations, health facilities damaged due shellings and in poor material condition. In addition, many healthcare staff were infected by COVID very rapidly. Almost 60,000 healthcare staff in Ukraine only in the governmental controlled side. Unfortunately, for the non-governmental side, we are unable to assess the situation and to have precise figures. However, MDM staff on the non-governmental controlled area are reporting a very similar situation with regards to the lack of medical staff, lack of appropriate protection equipment, and a high rate of infection by COVID. Critical difficulties with oxygen supply and lack of life-saving medical equipment. The population living in the conflict-affected area is mainly composed of elderly people. As if we were looking into the patients of Medicos del Mundo, 60% of our patients are elderly. Most of them are women, 74%. Often we're talking about single-headed households. 25% of those, they live with at least one disability. And over 35% have difficulties too. Most of them present at least one chronic condition and need specific medical attention. COVID-19 exacerbated the situation not only in the healthcare sector, but also had a strong impact on the economy, employment, livelihood, education, increasing the severity of needs and vulnerabilities. It also had a devastating impact due to the closure of crossing points from the governmental to the non-governmental controlled areas almost 10 months ago in response to COVID. Today, crossings are only possible for humanitarian reasons and are very much limited. That situation negatively affects the population in the non-governmental controlled area in the first place, especially elderly people who cannot access their pensions provided on the governmental controlled side. It also affects our capacity to organize convoys and deliver life-saving medical donations into the non-governmental controlled area. The drop in crossing has another consequence, the backlog of legal cases. Humanitarian agencies estimate to several dozens of thousands backlog legal cases to be brought to the governmental controlled area authorities after the crossing points become operational, for the situations such as registration of birth or death that happened in the non-governmental controlled area during the period of limitation of movements. The question of 1.4 million IDPs in Ukraine requires also further actions and support. The current system of IDP registration needs to take more into account specific needs of this population, in particular to facilitate access to housing and livelihood opportunities, and to ensure equal access to essential services. Holding IDP certificate should not be a precondition to accessing these services. As for all countries, the issue of COVID-19 vaccination is critical, and MDM is ready to support all the initiatives that the government and international community will implement to assure equal access of the population to the vaccination, including those most vulnerable and difficult to reach on both sides of the line of contact. We call for total transparency in the selection and distribution of vaccine using internationally recognized scientific data, as well on the selection criteria of priority groups, which should include the healthcare workers on both sides of the line of contact. Besides, vaccination should not be used for political means, but treated as what it is, a public health issue. Governed by the international humanitarian law, access to vaccine needs to be ensured for all conflict-affected population without discrimination on both sides of the line of contact. Vaccination is a long-term solution for COVID-19, while in the short term, we need to continue our efforts to provide a strong response to the pandemic. And I would like to call for support to the governments of Ukraine and to the humanitarian organizations to continue providing this life-saving assistance. As a humanitarian actor operationally present in the non-governmental controlled area, I witness the difficulties faced by the humanitarian community to access this area. Very few organizations are authorized to operate, and even with authorization, our capacity to reach the people in need is very limited. We are limited in our capacity to assess the humanitarian situation, identify and analyze the most pressing needs based on evidence and first-hand data, and to provide humanitarian assistance to the most vulnerable according to the core humanitarian standards and principles. As humanitarian actors, our work is guided by neutrality and partiality. We are therefore calling all parts to increase operational capacity and access for humanitarian agencies to the population in the non-governmental controlled area, according to the international humanitarian law principles. Finally, I would like to underline the importance of having a common framework for all humanitarian agencies to have a coordinated response and cover most pressing needs. Therefore, I would like to use this opportunity to call on donors and member states to continue providing support to Ukraine and to the humanitarian community through the HRP to ensure that there is a strong support to the population in their needs of humanitarian assistance at the door of European Union. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your compelling message, and also thank you for the wonderful work that MDM does on the ground with really hearing from you now with a very, very dire need. If Excellencies you allow, we'll just turn to a short film before we come to speakers, Q&A session and speakers on the floor, so to speak. It's a short video that the OCHA Ukraine officers made. We'll turn to that now and then come to our Excellencies on the floor.
education, food security, and livelihoods to health, shelter, education, and protection services. Over 120 UN agencies, international and national non-governmental organizations are going to be working on both sides of the contact line to help meet the needs of the most vulnerable. For the response to reach those most in need, humanitarian actors require $168 million in 2021. With the existing needs caused by the ongoing armed conflict compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic, the people residing in eastern Ukraine need our support now more than ever. Support the Humanitarian Response Plan for Ukraine. For more information, check the link under this video. Quick, we need to hide! This is Alexei and his family. In 2014, their home was severely damaged. Alexei's father was also injured by a grenade that exploded in their yard. As they had nowhere to go and little money saved, they were forced to stay in a half-destroyed house in the hope that hostilities would stop soon. It has now been 7 years, and no solution has yet been found. There are many families in Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast who, like Alexei's, have exhausted their resources and must now rely on others to survive. There are 3.4 million people that were affected by the armed conflict and are in need of assistance this year. Hundreds of thousands of them were forced to flee the region as their homes were destroyed and livelihoods scorched. Families and communities who stayed behind have been divided by the conflict's front line, the 427-kilometer long contact line. The contact line severed people from critical health and social services, making it hard for them to receive medical treatment or to collect hard-earned pensions. The COVID-19 pandemic has further exacerbated their vulnerabilities, making it close to impossible for families and relatives living on the different sides of the contact line to reunite or for people to access the services they so desperately need. The humanitarian community has been present on the ground since the beginning of the armed conflict, trying to assist those most in need. In 2021, 3.4 million people will need assistance and protection. Humanitarian actors will seek to provide urgent assistance to 1.9 million people on both sides of the contact line under the new response plan. The planned assistance will range from water and sanitation, food security, and livelihoods to health, shelter, education, and protection services. Over 120 UN agencies, international and national non-governmental organizations are going to be working on both sides of the contact line to help meet the needs of the most vulnerable. For the response to reach those most in need, humanitarian actors require $168 million in 2021. With the existing needs caused by the ongoing armed conflict compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic, the people residing in eastern Ukraine need our support now more than ever. Support the Humanitarian Response Plan for Ukraine. For more information, check the link under this video.
Thank you, and thank you for your patience with the technical issues we had at the start. So please let me turn to our excellencies on the floor. I first go to the ambassador and head of the European Union delegation, please.
Thank you very much, Reena, and colleagues. Good morning, and a special appreciation to, of course, to the remarks and the people who spoke early in the meeting, but most importantly to those who are out in the front lines working to relieve the humanitarian situation in Ukraine as we speak. And thank you for the video. It was powerful both with and without sound. Look, the EU position when it comes to the political aspects of the situation in Ukraine are well known about Russian aggression and the violations of international law. So I will focus on the humanitarian situation today, which is the topic of the briefing. And I want to say that the European Union is supporting the conflict-affected population in eastern Ukraine since the beginning of the conflict, and this will remain a priority for the European Union. This is a strong message I want to send today. And I believe we are, together with our member states, the biggest donor of humanitarian aid and early recovery development assistance to Ukraine with 1 billion euros of assistance since the beginning of the conflict. But we are certainly concerned that after almost 7 years, the humanitarian crisis is still very much present, as you all have indicated today, and how the COVID-19 pandemic has actually made things worse, in particular in the non-government controlled areas, due to the almost complete closure of the crossing points at the line of contact. We're also concerned about the access or the lack of access to humanitarian organizations to the non-government controlled areas, in particular in Luhansk, and how this has worsened over the last year. So we back very much the recent humanitarian coordinator's statement, which calls to facilitate humanitarian operations in these areas in adherence with international humanitarian law and other international standards. We welcome the more inclusive approach of the current government towards affected people on both sides of the line of contact. Yet more needs to be done to ensure the people in eastern Ukraine access to their basic rights. There is a need to address the legal and regulatory framework affecting conflict-affected populations, such as improving compensation and restitution mechanisms to address the losses for housing and land property damaged or destroyed, enabling pensioners in the non-government controlled areas to get their pensions, and improving the legislation and policies that facilitate movement of people and of humanitarian goods for civilian needs, as I mentioned before. Furthermore, the indiscriminate shelling of residential areas and critical civilian infrastructure, despite the ceasefire agreement of last July, remains of concern. It's important for both parties to the conflict to respect international humanitarian law. Implementation of the Mine Action Law, with establishment of a national mine action center to address the contamination by mines and unexploded ordnances in conflict-affected areas, is urgently needed. And all crossing points need to be safely reopened, allowing the elderly to get their pensions to avoid an increase of the already acute humanitarian crisis. And I want to say that as we demand this, we are also ready to support these measures in any way we can. Finally, despite an acute need in humanitarian assistance, in particularly non-government controlled areas, the response remains seriously underfunded. My dear friend Sergiy, the Ambassador of Ukraine, mentioned this, and many others. We will remain committed to provide humanitarian assistance to eastern Ukraine and to coordinate with early recovery, development support, and peace-building efforts. But we also ask others to come in and help to fund the appeal. Thank you very much, Reena, again, for getting us together.
Thank you, Ambassador. Let me now please hand the floor to the Ambassador of the Permanent Mission of Canada.
Thank you very much, Reena, for giving me briefly the microphone, and thank you so much for an excellent presentation. And I bring greetings to my colleague, Ambassador Kyslytsya. It's good to I've been authorized by my government to announce that we are ready to increase our commitment by $5.5 million. The end of our fiscal year is the end of March, so I'm announcing it now so that you'll be aware of it. And I don't have the money on me, but I'm authorized to indicate that it's there and we're ready to contribute. we've contributed 50 million since the onset of the crisis, and we recognize this is, as time goes on, it becomes clear to all of us that political and military conflict is at the root, obviously, of the humanitarian crisis. And while we are certainly absolutely prepared to continue to support people in need, I do think it's critically important for us also to emphasize the need for a heightened effort to find a political resolution of the conflict. Many of the humanitarian and refugee situations that we see around the world are now lasting not for a few years, but for decades. And they tend to become permanently embedded in the geographic structures where they're located. And the problems are frequently extremely difficult to resolve. And this is no exception. The one exception to this situation, of course, is looking at the film. I couldn't help but noticing the demographics of who is getting assistance, who is required. Of the almost 2 million who are being targeted for aid, close to 50% of them are seniors. This is an almost unique among refugee populations or people who are living in deep stress in situations like we're seeing in Ukraine and in Eastern Ukraine. It is extremely troubling to see the lack of response from the Russians to finding a permanent settlement that clearly reflects the interests of all sides, the interests of the people of Eastern Ukraine, and the territorial integrity of Ukraine, which it's clear that the Russians are not interested in respecting in any significant way. So we will be there. We will continue to support OCHA in its work. We will be there on behalf of the Canadian government to assist the government of Ukraine, and we'll be there to assist in this particular humanitarian project. But we urge Russia to come to the table with some serious political proposals that will allow for a resolution of the conflict. That, I think, is a central objective of where we are now. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Ambassador, for those comments. Let me now please turn to the Ambassador for the Permanent Mission to Lithuania, Your Excellency.
Thank you very much, and also join colleagues, Reena, to expressing our gratitude for organizing this timely briefing about the really devastating situation in the eastern Ukraine. Thank you for first-hand information from the ground about the situation, which is bad and it's getting worse. And but we very much appreciate. We noted the Ukrainian actions, the government of Ukraine, to ease the situation of the people, IDPs, and in the eastern Ukraine. So we very welcome, and I can assure Lithuanian full support for Ukrainian action in this humanitarian area, but also politically as well. So I don't unfortunately have instruction as my Canadian colleague to announce some additional fundings, but I can ensure that we would support politically as well on non-recognition basis of occupied territorial and supporting the territorial integrity of Ukraine, but also on the humanitarian issues. As we heard today from briefings, the restriction of freedom of movement is the biggest concern. The worst thing that affects vulnerable population, civil population, women, elderly, children, so which really had the heaviest burden, and lack of basic services, main infrastructures is the biggest concern. So I just can repeat that Ukrainian side, but we have to not to forget that there is another side, and it was mentioned as well, Russia's and its role and influence as well on easing this conflict. So I think we have to call on Russia to use all its influence over the armed formations in Donbass and demand to stop obstructing work of international personnel. It's unacceptable then international personnel, including humanitarian workers, international missions, do not have free access to those territories. It is, as it was mentioned, it's very important to maintain humanitarian support to Ukraine, and as I mentioned, Lithuania will do that, and we urge other members and actors, member states and other actors to do that further. But we also not should forget that only sustainable political solution of the ongoing conflict will have a lasting impact on the humanitarian situation in this region. So in this regard as well, we call upon Russia to assume its responsibilities as a signatory to Minsk agreements in seeking to end the war in Donbass as a full respect to the sovereignty of Ukrainian territory. And here I would like also to ask, to put the question about the cooperation with other UN agencies and private sector, maybe, and non-governmental organization. My Ukrainian colleague mentioned our involvement in UNICEF as well. So if you see there's any shortages or lesson learned in this cooperation and whether we could assist or we could help, that please let us know as well. So, and thank you once again for having us. Thank you for this information, and let's continue working together. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Let me pass the floor now, please, to the representative from Poland.
Thank you. My name is Mariusz Lewicki. I'm the Deputy Permanent Representative of Poland to the UN. And first of all, let me thank OCHA for organizing this very timely and important meeting, and also for this interactive format with this polling video. And let me also express our deep appreciation for OSNAT and for her team, for all UN colleagues working under challenging circumstances in the field, because your work is making a real difference for all these people in dire situation. We are now in 2021, so it has been already 6 years from the Russian aggression against Ukraine was launched, and this aggression caused this dire humanitarian situation. Unfortunately, the conflict is far from over, and it only underlines the need for the continued humanitarian assistance. I can fully subscribe with all what our boss, the head of the EU delegation, has said. Poland is also providing assistance on a bilateral basis. We regularly contribute to OCHA General Partnership Support, OCHA's office in Kiev, and in 2019 we also supported Ukraine by contributing to continue to country-based full fund, and I can assure you that Poland is committed to support Ukraine in the upcoming years. I have a follow-up question on what Ambassador of Lithuania, Audra, has mentioned about the challenges you are facing in the field in your daily work. So, OSNAT, you have already highlighted problems with access to some areas, and I can only join all these calls to all sides to fully respect international humanitarian law. So could you please, OSNAT, tell us what are the challenges are you facing and how we can help you in your work? Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Ambassador. Let me now please turn to the representative from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Ghelani. Thank you, OCHA, for convening us. We really appreciate this briefing, and thank you to the Human Mission of Ukraine. So happy to see familiar faces, Deputy Minister Yaremenko. So very much appreciate this very timely briefing. Situation in humanitarian, devastating humanitarian situation in Ukraine is something that we can very much sympathize, because we are experiencing very similar developments in the occupied regions of Georgia, and much appreciation and words of a lot of commending goes to the government of Ukraine for all its activities that we heard here, including the building of the administrative centers at the checkpoints, important work that is done there, and that makes the humanitarian work of OCHA even more important, and our appreciation to the mission there. But just to say one more time, as noted above, that obviously this humanitarian issues cannot be solved without addressing the root causes of the conflict. Therefore, again, our affirmation for the full deoccupation and demilitarization of the and full support for Ukraine's territorial integrity. And in that sense, I would like to thank Ambassador Kyslytsya for reminding us about the debate later this month on the occupied territories, where we will participate, and of course our full support to that. So once again, our appreciation for that. Indeed, COVID has made the humanitarian challenges even more acute and harder, and there is indeed increased need for international community to direct more resources. I also cannot announce anything concrete in terms of our contribution, but we will certainly be supporting the Ukraine in those attempts, and particularly the reintegration policy, which we see is very ambitious and something that we very much share, and see a lot of commonalities with our also our policy of reintegration with the occupied territories of Donetsk. So thank you very much for my contribution to Ukraine and OCHA. Our full support in that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now hand the floor to the representative from Norway, please.
Yes, hello. Hi. Thank you, and thank you to OCHA for organizing this event, and thank you to the briefers and the work that's being carried on the ground despite challenging circumstances. Norway, the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine is first and foremost a protection crisis, and after 6 years, we are extremely concerned that the main challenge is to reach the most vulnerable people in need. Norway is a committed donor of humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, focusing on the needs on both sides of the contact line. Norwegian support includes shelter repair, legal counseling for IDPs, migrants, and protection of schools. And following Ukraine's endorsement of the Safe Schools Declaration in 2019, we strongly encourage the focus to be on implementation of the practical guidelines, as there are many best practices to learn from. Another issue of concern is landmines and explosives that pose a major threat to civilians on both sides of the contact line. And there is a real need for a survey and clearance of contaminated areas in Ukraine. It is important that Ukraine implement the adopted mine action legislation and clarify the division of labor between governing bodies, which still needs to be established. Involvement of local and national NGOs in the implementation of humanitarian response is important. This means capacity building for sustainable communities. We had hoped that Norway's support through the Humanitarian Country Fund would lead to increased localization and humanitarian access to people in need, particularly in the non-government controlled areas. However, due to COVID-19, it has become much harder to reach the most vulnerable population. Meanwhile, the way forward in the government-controlled areas should be guided by an integrated nexus approach. Donors, the UN, and the Ukraine government in their respective capacities have a mission to bring recovery and development in the Donbas region. In line with our humanitarian strategy, Norway is working to coordinate humanitarian development and peace efforts. Better financing across the nexus is one of the ways in which donors can create the right incentives for our partners to move beyond institutional silos and deliver results together. We regret that Humanitarian Response Plan in Ukraine being severely underfunded. Nevertheless, we would like to stress that the crisis-affected population in Donbas is not forgotten, and its urgent needs must be met, including with support from Norway. I would like to thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to the representative from Norway. Let me now hand the floor to the representative from Sweden, please.
Thank you very much, and thanks to OCHA for convening this and for all the comprehensive overview of the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. I also want to echo what Olof said, thanking Irina and all other humanitarian staff on the ground, of course. So the fact that we have a man-made protracted humanitarian crisis in Europe is, of course, a great concern for us. And as the Humanitarian Response Plan outlines, this crisis primarily affects the elderly, people with disabilities, female-headed households, and children. Sweden has had, I think, 3 ministerial visits to eastern Ukraine in the last 18 months, including a visit by a foreign minister this January in her capacity as OSCE chairperson in office, where she delivered quite strong humanitarian messages, which I will not repeat. Sweden has also been a strong supporter of humanitarian assistance. We contributed some $3.3 million last year, and we expect to maintain similar levels this year, pending final decision back home. So addressing the humanitarian crisis is crucial, not only because people living on both sides of the contact line deserves it, but also as an element in finding a sustainable political solution in line with OSCE principles and commitments, with full respect, of course, for Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. In Ukraine, like everywhere else, international humanitarian law must be respected in full, and this includes, like Reena and Osnat both said, full and unimpeded humanitarian access on both sides of the contact line. It's quite evident that full respect for the ceasefire that was agreed already many years ago would be the best way to reduce humanitarian needs. And we, of course, hope that like Osnat said, that the positive trend from July, which seems to have been broken in recent weeks, will soon resume. The Ukrainian participants mentioned the opening of more crossing points and administrative centers, which is, of course, very welcome. And also in view of the impact of the mobility restrictions on the already vulnerable populations. So I would just like to conclude here with 2 questions, if I may. First of all, on COVID vaccines, whether this will be integrated in the humanitarian response or whether it will be handled by the Ukrainian national system. And I was also wondering about needs arising from environmental challenges. It was mentioned briefly, but I was wondering if there's space for the development side to do a bit more to counter this, and specifically if there has been any progress on ensuring more sustainable water provision, which up until now has depended on humanitarian support. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And there have been some other questions and comments which our panel members may want to reflect on at the end. So I will come back to our panel members who may want to intervene at that point. I now hand the floor, please, to the representative from Romania. Thank you.
Good morning. I would like to commend OCHA for organizing this briefing and to thank the briefers for their insightful presentations. Romania is one of the countries providing assistance to Ukraine, both bilaterally and through multilateral instruments. In December 2020, Romania made a voluntary contribution of 150,000 euro to the Humanitarian Response Plan managed by OCHA in Ukraine, aimed at providing emergency assistance in the form of water and hygiene, health, housing, food, education, and protection, especially to people affected by the conflict in the Donbas region, including in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Bilaterally in 2020, with the help of Romania, 2 kindergartens were renovated and equipped, one in Murnovsky, Donetsk region, and one in Sergiy Vodiane, Zakarpattia. Romania also donated to the Regional Hospital of Oncology in Chernivtsi 10,000 euro in order to purchase PPE in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. We will continue to monitor the humanitarian situation, and as part of our international development cooperation and humanitarian assistance strategic program for 2020-2023, we are ready to continue to provide bilateral assistance to Ukraine in various areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me now please hand the floor to the representative from Germany.
No, thank you very much, Reena. Thank you and your team for organizing this timely event. Thank you, Osnat, for your compelling remarks, and I would like to transmit the personal admiration and appreciation for your work from my Ambassador Heusken. Your tireless work on the ground is respected, and please continue the way you are doing this. Thank you, Reena, for, I think you and medical personnel and the organization you're representing are standing in the forefront of every humanitarian crisis, and especially of the COVID crisis. You are taking the most risk, and we really have to appreciate this very highly. Excellencies, dear colleagues, I would only join my EU colleagues in focusing only on the humanitarian consequences of the conflict today. And I would like to reflect on 3 points Osnat mentioned. First, humanitarian principles. Yes, this should be above all. And this should guide your work, this should guide how your work is considered, and this should guide our actions to permit your work from all parties involved. This is very important to stressing this, and we for sure we will support you in this. Second, access. Access, always the most important thing in humanitarian crisis, and especially now in Ukraine as the contact lines are needed. This is needed. More organizations should work, should have the possibility to work on the ground, and we all have to work on this. Third, funding. Funding, as you rightly mentioned, last year we increased our contribution to nearly 27 million. Total of 170 million since the beginning of the crisis in 2014, and I can happily announce that we will stand to this commitment, and we will also provide the increased amount this year. But I think as needs increase, more countries have to step in, and so we need a joint effort not to forget the crisis and the plight of the people in Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your intervention. And let me now please hand the floor to the representative from the United States of America.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Reena. Thank you, Osnat. Thank you, Mr. Yaremenko, for the information shared at this briefing. We find these briefings extremely useful, especially on these crises that garner comparatively less attention and perhaps less than they should, such as the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. So thank you very much. I very much align myself with a point made by Elmar from Germany right before me regarding the risks taken, Osnat, by you and your humanitarian partners on the ground, and Reena, indeed, by humanitarian partners around the world. Please, Osnat, do take every opportunity that you can to relay partners on the ground our heartfelt appreciation for everything that they do and for the risks that they take, in fact, to do the work that we fund and ask them to do as donors. So thank you very much for that. United States is proud to remain the largest single humanitarian donor to Ukraine HRP, although we are, of course, very happy to share the spot of being one of the top donors with European Union and its members. We note with concern the funding shortages for this response plan. We remain committed to helping alleviate the humanitarian needs in Ukraine. I will use the limited, I think there are a number of humanitarian issues that have already been covered, but really I will use the limited time to underscore that at this time, the first and foremost concern for the United States are in fact the reports from frontline humanitarian actors about access restrictions by the local so-called authorities that I think was quite clearly outlined today. We are particularly concerned about most recently in the past week about reports to us that some UN organizations may be at risk of ceasing to be able to operate in Russia-controlled parts of Luhansk. As was already stated before, it is certainly a priority for the United States that safe, timely, and unimpeded access is paramount, and humanitarian issues should be treated in a non-political light. In this regard, we call on Russia to use their influence on Russia's proxies in Ukraine to allow such impartial access. If there is time, I would just pose one question. I know that we're short on time, but the Humanitarian Response Plan notes that COVID-19 created opportunities to negotiate for greater humanitarian access with the self-proclaimed local authorities. And that's, of course, something that we have also seen around the world. But what we've also seen around the world is that oftentimes COVID-19 is actually being used to constrain access. So if there is time, I would appreciate reflections on whether these opportunities offered by COVID-19 have actually manifested themselves, as it seems that increased humanitarian access is not in reality in Ukraine right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. We will now turn to two more speakers from the floor. I note that we have about 10 minutes left, and then we will return to the panel for some final comments. So please, let me first go to the UNHCR representative to Ukraine. Pablo, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I also would like to thank OCHA for organizing this very timely briefing. As some of you know, I have been in Ukraine for more than 5 years, and I can say that the situation for humanitarian action is still there, but has changed. I would like to give a couple of examples from our own experience in repairing civilian homes damaged by the conflict and in our protection work. UNHCR, together with other organizations, especially the Norwegian Refugee Council, have been helping families to repair damaged homes. In total, UNHCR has repaired over 22,000 homes since the beginning of the conflict, with support from donor countries and the European Union. In government-controlled areas, we have seen real progress thanks to the government of Ukraine's efforts. The State Emergency Service of Ukraine is now doing the repairs of damaged houses in Donetsk Oblast, using materials supplied by the Oblast administrations and tools supplied by UNHCR. In 2020, the State Emergency Service managed to repair nearly 1,300 homes. We hope that the same will be replicated in Luhansk Oblast. This should lead to government leadership in the humanitarian shelter sector and an eventual discontinuation of the shelter cluster. On the protection front, progress has also been made. As mentioned by Deputy Minister Yaremenko, IDPs now have full voting rights. And in 2020, the government launched a program for compensation of houses destroyed by the conflict. During the first 3 months, this compensation program awarded compensation for 74 families, totaling some 600,000 euros. However, there are still some outstanding protection issues that have been mentioned already by Ms. Lubrani, for example, in the area of pensions, birth registration, freedom of movement, and social inclusion of IDPs. But under the leadership of the UN Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator, we will continue to advocate for solutions in these areas. Now, UNHCR, like all other humanitarian organizations, we work strictly on a humanitarian basis, and some of us are working on both sides of the contact line. This means that we also deliver assistance in the non-government control areas of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast. Unfortunately, as mentioned by other speakers, the access of humanitarian organizations is often restricted by those in control in the non-government control areas. We echo the call made earlier by Ms. Lubrani on all concerned parties to ensure that the humanitarian work of organizations like UNHCR is facilitated in non-government control areas. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your remarks, Pablo. Let me turn to the UNFPA representative to Ukraine, please. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, Excellencies, Ambassador Kyslytsya, representative from Médicos del Mundo, representatives from other member states, civil organizations, colleagues from the UN system, in particular Ms. Lubrani, Resident Coordinator. Let me first of all express our gratitude to the government of Ukraine and to all the member states and the partners that have been supporting our work dealing with gender-based violence in the front lines of the conflict in eastern Ukraine. And let me in particular highlight the fundamental support that we have received from the United Kingdom, Canada, Estonia, and more recently from Sweden and from the European Union. It has already been stated, the complex humanitarian crisis in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, has been further deteriorated by the COVID-19 pandemic. We have observed a significant increase in the demand for protection services from GVP and DV, domestic violence survivors. The increase, depending on the kind of services, ranging from 50% to nearly 90%, was particularly acute during the lockdown, and the numbers are not yet back to the pre-COVID-19 level. The security, the well-being, and the full exercise of basic human rights of women and girls remains a challenge, especially along the contact line and in remote rural areas. Access to essential GVB response services in the areas close to and along the contact line remains limited, and the capacity of local service providers to respond to and to prevent gender-based violence in an intersectorial, comprehensive way is still insufficient. The demand for specialized support is growing. For instance, just to give you some data, in July 2020, the GVB subcluster co-chairing bodies informed that the number of cases of domestic violence reported to the social services in the conflict-affected areas had increased by more than 86% in the second quarter of 2020 compared to the first quarter of 2020. This represents a 54% increase in the second quarter of 2020 compared to the previous year for the same reporting period. The humanitarian crisis in eastern Ukraine is protracted. Protection needs, risk, and vulnerability of women and girls to GVB are high. There is a clear call for greater collaboration and coordination between humanitarian and developmental actors to ensure durable solutions. In particular, let me highlight the humanitarian access to NGCA to provide survivors and those at risk with GVB services, because basically, their access to those services is severely restricted. What are the priorities for UNFPA in terms of responding to GVB in the context of the HRP 2021? We will continue developing a well-targeted and geographically focused intervention along the contact line on the needs of women and girls, but also focusing targeting persons with disabilities, older persons, and female-headed households. We will continue strengthening the multisectorial response and the referral systems adjusted to the new national decentralization process at regional, municipal, and community levels in the conflict-affected areas. We will continue ensuring the provision of emergency and time-critical assistance, as well as access to basic GVB prevention and response services with due regard to the humanitarian exit strategy GCA from 2021 to 2023. We will continue ensuring that GVB prevention and response systems in the GCA address the humanitarian and development issues and put in place durable solutions as part of the humanitarian development nexus, feeding into and becoming part of a systemic national response. And we will continue reaching out to people in need in the NGCA through remote online assistance and through existing service delivery points along the contact line. In closing, let me reiterate our thanks to the donor community and to the government of Ukraine, including the national, regional, and local authorities, for the outstanding cooperation and partnership, and pledge the UNFPA support to continue involved in building, to rebuild the social fabric in the conflict-affected areas in Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We are coming close to the closing, but please allow me to give the floor briefly to some of our panel members to respond to some of the questions and comments. Your Excellency, Yaremenko, please, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you, Director Ghelani. Well, first of all, I'll try to be very brief. I know that I'm still in your time, but nevertheless, definitely I shall start with expressing our appreciation for all that support which we have already received from the member states. And of course, we do really appreciate Canada's increase of their support further this year. I probably shall reply to a number of questions posed to me earlier. With regard to the engagement of UNICEF and OCHA in the next year, we are very much interested in projects of distance learning, and of course we will ask for the support to our new project focused on the development of Crimean Tatar language, which is heavily restricted in Crimea. With regard to our Swedish colleague, we do really appreciate the visit of Her Excellency Minister Linda to Ukraine earlier this year. I had the privilege and honor to be with the minister at the east of Ukraine and visited one of the checkpoints. We would like to emphasize the issue of environment protection, and here I would like to refer to one coal mining. The name of that coal mining is Yaremenko. As you may know, in early 1970s, last century, there was an explosion of atomic energy, and there is a special capsule which is keeping the remnants from that explosion in safe position, but the water is rising, and we are very much want to emphasize that may cause a serious environmental damage. The water may go either to Rostov or, I don't know, to the Azov Sea and then to the Black Sea. We have already focused our attention to that problem, and we already informed on that the International Atomic Energy Agency, but we would like to share that information with you as well. Also, let me say, and let me draw your attention to one more issue, though I want to speak a lot, the concentration camp in Donetsk. We call it isolation. It was a former factory of isolation instruments, but after the beginning of the war, it has been used as a concentration camp. We cannot even call it as a place of deprivation of liberty. It's a real concentration camp, and we are asking international community to deliver our signal to the Russian Federation and give the access to, especially ICRC, to provide access to that place of deprivation isolation. Probably I'll stop here, and if you all have further questions, I will be ready to answer that. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Deputy Minister. Please let me now hand the floor back to the humanitarian coordinator. Osnat, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your all of the words of support. I think it's really, how can I say, it's energizing to hear, and because the work is difficult, but it really means a lot to me and to all of the humanitarian partners. I'll use my time just to sort of respond to some of the questions, maybe on the issue of the problems of access. You know, as I mentioned in my statement, you know, we in areas that are not under government control, we count on everyone that is concerned to facilitate the humanitarian operations in adherence with humanitarian law and international standards. And currently in the Luhansk region, we are facing more restrictions. I do want to say, however, that I'm hopeful. You know, we continue to argue for greater access, and I believe that since the statement and having your words of support and having you speak to others, I think it is helping. So we are trying to find solutions. On the issue of vaccines, while it is not specifically included in the HRP, you know, I work very closely with WHO and the government of Ukraine on the vaccines issues. WHO and UNICEF actually are in the lead on this nationally, and the areas that are not under government control the population is included in the government plan. Of course, as a humanitarian community, to the extent that our support is needed, we will look into that and we'll be ready to assist as much as we can. And then on the question on the balance between certainly the COVID-19 has placed new constraints, and I think I spoke about it before. The abrupt extreme closure and inability of people to cross has made things more difficult. At the same time, there are also opportunities for us because the health needs are a rising priority, and there is interest and need for the humanitarian assistance. And so through, particularly more recently, through the Ukraine Humanitarian Fund, we have been able to obtain permission to do more on supporting the response to the COVID-19, including in areas that are not under government control. So it's a bit, as you said, a bit of a mixed picture. So I just conclude by saying a big thanks and thank you for considering, for pledging support, some of you already, which is so good to hear, and others for considering to support us throughout the year under the HRP. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me just briefly also hand the floor over to Reena. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I also would like to join my voice to thank everyone actually for all the words that I heard, and it was extremely interesting discussion. I would like also to share my gratitude to all the donors that are supporting the action of Médicos del Mundo since 6 years, to the European Union, Germany, the United States, Canada, and other international organizations. I'm also happy to also share that the new mechanism that was established with this humanitarian fund, Ukrainian Humanitarian Fund, seems flexible and efficient for NGOs. So I hope that it will continue to operate and bring new ideas also for the future actions and future funding. And to conclude at the end, I just would like to summarize the 5 asks from MDM and from other NGOs is to continue supporting the fight against COVID, to ensure equal access to vaccination. I heard that the government is included in it, of course, but I think it's important also to think about the frontline workers, health workers, fighting COVID, and to integrate them in priority plans. We are calling to also, of course, to facilitate and resume operations at crossing points and for the freedom of movement, to support the humanitarian community and access into NDC, and to continue providing strong support to the government of Ukraine and to humanitarian agencies to assist the women, men, and children that are most in need. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, Excellencies, let me close by first thanking very much the government of Ukraine for the partnership that we have. And we will continue to work to reach and access and fight for those who need it most and are the most vulnerable. I'd like to thank the member states that stayed. We have gone over time, but it really is encouraging and shows your commitment and your strategic support, not just financial, to humanitarian operations in Ukraine. We're extremely grateful, and I think as the humanitarian coordinator said, it helps to see that commitment so strongly at New York level as well, and encourage us to keep going. And we look to you and your continued support and commitment to that. Thank you very much. I close now. We have gone slightly over, but it is an important discussion, and we're very, very grateful for your time today. Thank you. Thank you, colleagues.